Welcome everyone, welcome indeed to our Theory of Practice tutorial. Now, unlike our regular workshop-specific tutorials, our Theory of Practice tutorials we see as an opportunity to address your most immediate, most pressing questions, no matter what workshop they may be coming from. We also think of them as an opportunity to catch up and clarify, wherever it's needed, any key distinctions from other recent tutorials. Now, this particular tutorial will take the form of a live Q&A session. So instead of the typical narrative that we try and weave our prepared answers into, for this event we will be on the spot, spontaneously answering your live questions, which effectively will turn it into a single, continuous plenary session. Now, to preface all of this, I want to start with this fundamental distinction, demonstrating process versus explaining methodology. And if we think about this for a moment, if we define a process as to how we do something, the specific steps we take that are practical and repeatable, such as the actions we were creating in reverse engineering in the last tutorial, versus a methodology, which is more the why, if you like, the principles behind why we are undertaking those steps in that process, which therefore is more conceptual rather than practical. It's more philosophical and evolving rather than being a locked-in, repeatable action. So because I like to have a framework to frame, at least initially, our points of departure, I thought this may be helpful. Not just dictating, but exploring. Not just actioning, but investigating and discussing and pondering. And hence, not just our actions, but the reverse engineering of our actions and so on. So, welcome to our Q&A. Let's see where we go with this. Remember, this is unscripted, and it's us trying to respond and demonstrate both methodology and process in how we go about addressing your questions. So we're talking process, we're talking steps in a workflow. This is interesting because remember, we've got two print workshops. We've got the actual making of prints, the fine art digital print making workshop, and then we've got this idea of crafting, the file preparation. And it's in that workshop, crafting a digital print workshop, to look at a conceptual framework. As you're saying, there's steps involved. We can then take your engagement with our Photoshop masterclass and filter it through the process we present in the Crafting a Digital Print workshop. That, I think, will be a really good way of tying what you're currently studying with us into a framework, a process, rather than just instances of, oh, you can do this, and this is why you might do this, that sort of fireworks approach, into a larger set of considerations of how we can do these things with more reason rather than happenstance, with more process rather than just hope and desire. So let's jump into our Crafting a Digital Print workshop for a second, and just one overriding principle from that workshop, one set of notes that we use as the framework. And let's just see if this doesn't help provide a bit of support. What do I do first, second and third? But also the methodology behind the process, why I'm doing that, and that might be not just an interesting discussion, but also helpful in this particular case. Okay, from our Crafting a Digital Print workshop, let's start with this PDF, which is the overriding framework within which everything, including all of the different stages and questions and dot points, for example, in our May Crafting a Digital Print tutorial, they all fit within this workflow and its process. The methodology will reveal itself along the way. So we think of post-capture as a discovery phase. We're converting raw data into RGB data in most instances. For us, it's an initial exploration of the image as a picture. We're going from data to what I like to call not just an image, but a picture, something with meaning attached. Now, during that, roughing the image in, and all of the possibilities, warmer, cooler, lighter, darker, harder, softer, more mysterious, less mysterious, we settle on a particular rendering, a particular mood, mainly global adjustments, shaping that dramatic content, making it more forlorn or happier and brighter. And we are beginning local redistribution. And remember, this is our workflow. That's what we share with you in the Crafting a Digital Print. It's not theory, it's what we actually do. Therefore, we are always looking for those figure-ground relationships within the image. Figures, grounds, figures and grounds. Here is a figure on a ground. That then becomes a figure on another ground. Figure-ground relationships, whatever they are. I think it's really easy to conceive of this if it's a portrait of a person rather than a portrait of a rock or a portrait of a tree and so forth. But hopefully you get the distinction. Now, up until that point, there's a line in the sand, as I say in the workshop, that a lot of people don't need to cross over. Reportage, witness, documentary type photographers, all they need to do is to explore their raw data and then establish the mood according to some principle, which may be Andre's idea of indexicality, the truth statement. I'm a witness to what was there at that moment in front of the lens as I released the shutter and so forth. Or it might be some other consideration, scientific or philosophical or otherwise, that is required. So for a lot of us, we don't need to go past there. And of course, in the Adobe Photoshop Masterclass, let alone the Crafting a Digital Print workshop, all of these actions, presets, all of these ways of doing all sorts of amazing things to our images, fast and furious, but also with incredible sense of philosophical intrigue and countenance. We then get to this idea of refining the intellectual intent and the emotional focus. And this is where we look at the picture as if it was a theatrical stage, which is why I'm using this example, because you can see it's stage-like in its presentation. And then the elements that we've roughed in and established from the outset, we then begin to tease and define and apply a lot of those moves from the Adobe Photoshop Masterclass. We apply them to the image locally to intention their character, establish or resolve conflicts and create opportunities or clarify disputes. We're performing as if on a stage. So if I go into my Photoshop Masterclass actions and our enhanced presence action, let's apply that. There's my hide all layer mask with my nice soft brush, and let's apply that enhanced presence to certain areas. I'll just zoom in so you can see. Here's a gate with warning danger signs all over the place, proclaiming we should not enter. I'm just defining the gates and the structure from one to the other and the verge of the road. Let's turn all of that off. Let's turn all of that on. Let's turn all of that off. Let's turn all of that on. That's what we mean when I go back to this workflow in 3 stages, when I then start creating a dance, an interaction, because I'm telling a story above and beyond the indexicality of what was in front of the lens, where I'm trying to politically, philosophically, sociologically, personally, historically, culturally, trying to emphasize through a framework. A methodology is involved, and these are the processes I'm going through to try and make that a compelling, personal, let alone unifying, poetic, political, historical, cultural, whatever narrative, where I might be then employing all of the moves from the Adobe Photoshop Masterclass. Do you think it's in the aid of stage 1? No. Do you think it's in the end of stage 2? Well, maybe just a little bit here and there. No, the Adobe Photoshop Masterclass would probably be 50 or 60% about stage 3. Crafting a Digital Print is 100% about stage 3, with its toolkit, its workflow from the famous 5s all the way through. Volume 1, that's the capture in camera, which we then do the minimum processing of raw data to RGB. That's stage 1 of the Crafting a Digital Print post-capture workflow. And then we begin volume 3, volume 4, and volume 5. That is where we locally work on the tonal, the color, and bring those together to create the emotional, intellectual, philosophical, spatial, temporal compositions. So that is how we nest this process within another process, such as they're crafting a digital print. Whereas here we're starting to name the questions that are involved in both the initial minimum processing to RGB, but then subsequent interrogation in establishing the mood. Because remember, we're asking how lighter or darker does my image need to be, how sharper or warmer or cooler. We are establishing the mood. We're putting a peg in the ground. So that is how these dot points coalesce and give you yet another level you can engage within the Crafting a Digital Print workshop. And certainly that's what the workshop is dedicated to enabling you to do. But can you also see, this is the tricky thing, isn't it? because we've also got to have that opportunity to acknowledge all of these different components that combine to make a whole. The components in a print path that combine to result in the prints that we want to make, and so on and so forth. So it's impossible, as hard as we might try, in any one example, any one workshop, any one consultation, to encompass all of that. But it doesn't mean we're not conscious of trying to do that. And that's why we refer to these ideas both philosophically, methodologically, but also in terms of process-driven, these things we call frameworks. So this next question is about, it's not centering on the page when you've got borders. So we're exporting out of Capture One as a TIFF, dropping that in Mirage, and then positioning the image on the page, on the sheet, on the roll, adding borders and whatever else. So let's begin by looking at Mirage and this functionality that it offers, and the simplicity of that functionality, if you like. Let's start with this square image. I'm in Photoshop, and Mirage is loaded as a plugin, so I can call up Mirage right here within Photoshop. Now, remember in Mirage, we've got a distinction between the colorimetric settings and other settings preferences, which we lock away. These are the presets. And then the whole workflow is just down here. At the moment, there's our Epson printer, and there's the media package, the media type with the profile variant selected. And we're talking about printing on sheets, so let's select a sheet. Let's select a sheet size, the standard A3 sheet here in Australia. And straight away, we see a warning sign under image size. Now, at the moment, it's at 100%. So let's just click on the warning sign, and it automatically fits it to the page in the sense that, oh, it's had to shrink it down to 56.07%. It's just dumped it down at the lower part of the paper. This is a large format printer, so the pinch rollers which drive the paper and heavy canvas and you name it through the printer, they're huge. On a sheet like this, we can't print until within about 14 mil of the top edge. We can get 1/8 of an inch or 3 mil on each side, but not at the top because of the pinch rollers. So the dotted line is the printable area, whereas the white outline is the totality of the sheet. No borders are being applied. You can see they're set to 00000. Okay, now from image size to position, and by default it's positioned on the right. It could be positioned on the left, but it's meaningless because it's filling the full sheet of paper, whereas with a large roll we can place it anywhere, or indeed center it horizontally. It's already centered on the sheet, so clicking center horizontally doesn't do much where it's already being scaled and fitted to the maximum width it can print on that page. But if I click center on printable area, it will then center within the dotted lines. So it's not centered on the physical page. Center on the page does center it on the physical page, and it's still within the red dotted lines within the printable area. So the question is about adding borders. Now, this can be a little tricky because depending on whether you've rotated the image for best fit automatically, here the image was a square, and I chose that on purpose, so there's no rotation. But let's say it's a horizontal image that has automatically rotated to best fit on a vertical sheet like this. Then the borders are applied to the original, which is horizontal, not the rotated image. So that's just a little addendum to be careful of. The borders here are in centimeters. Let's put them into inches. And if I had a 1-inch border, 25 mil, thereabouts, and because of the equal sign, it is automatically applied to all 4 edges. Now, as long as an A3 sheet is in the printer, then this is what comes out. At least we've never not had that happen here. If I wanted to move the image up a little, then unclicking this and adding another 1/2 inch to the bottom margin moves it up. And that is the bottom margin because the image is unrotated. But if it's rotated, it's being applied to the unrotated bottom. Now, notice the slot or the frame, as it's called, in a rip like Mega Rip. We click out of there and we see it positioned on the white of, in this case, an A3 sheet. I click on the image, and we can have multiple images nested on the one roll or the one sheet. Clicking on each one or multiple ones then enable us to apply borders, or if we're nesting the placement and the gaps between images for trimming and so forth. I've got hundreds of images to print for a friend of mine. There'll be 5x7 proofs because we're working on his next book, and we're going to print on a roll of paper and a whole series of images across that roll with suitable gaps, and it'll keep printing, and each row gets automatically trimmed off. We'll then guillotine them into the individual images and so on. So that is how it's designed to work and how it has always worked for us. And we've always loved this about Mirage, because the slot is automatically created, unlike in Canon's PPL or Epson's print and layout applications, or MegaRip for that matter, where the slot is seen as a separate entity. Here, it is automatically conferred, which I think greatly simplifies working with a professional printing application. The other thing to check is page preview, print preview, and exact pixel edit preview. So I go to page preview, and you can see that's the slot, that's the frame, that's what they call the page. And we could have added trimming marks to crop the sheet accurately to that page. You can also go into this pixel exact preview and scroll around where you will see at 100% magnification, making sure that is absolutely spot on. There's a couple of extra things to double check in the workflow to try and eliminate any potential leakage there. So from our point of view, that is how placement and organization on sheets and rolls in Mirage works, and how it works for us without exception. Now, what about resizing in these printing applications, these rips? This is interesting as to how they do that. Mirage doesn't tell us how it does this. It just does it. As I fit an image and shrink it down percentage-wise or physically dragging it onto the page, just like Lightroom, it automatically scales, which means interpolates data. Now, it's extraordinary, though, that the results you tend to get out of Mirage, dropping a 60 by 40 inch print, as I was consulting with a friend the other day, onto an 11 by 14 inch sheet to make a proof for the client, and suddenly it's 56.07% magnification or reduction. Now, Mirage may very well be using a resizing algorithm of a much higher order of exactitude than what is available, let's say, in the Photoshops of the world. We also notice in Lightroom we have no control over those resizing algorithms. So let's answer this question in two parts. One, let's jump into Photoshop, where we do have a choice, but also plugins that we can then go to and look at all of the facilitation, and also jump into a fully fledged industrial rip and look at the facilitation it gives us that we don't get in Lightroom, we don't get in Mirage. So here's my image, and I'm ready to print. And the size of the file is 5,000 pixels across 42 centimeters. But I need to downsize this to, let's say, a 2,000 pixel JPEG for a web page. Now, in a program like Photoshop, we go up to a command like image size, and if we're asking it to resample the image, it gives us a series of options, which is, to Photoshop's credit, grown over the years. Effectively, nearest neighbor, it just replicates the pixels and turns them into more of the same pixels. Fantastic for printer profiling test charts where you need to resize it and not change the colorimetric data, but not much good for pictorial images because if they still stay pixelated or bilinear, 2 to the power of 2, that's only sampling 4 pixels surrounding the point where a new pixel needing new RGB triplets. So it basically blurs the living daylights out of our images. Great for preserving softness in clouds. Bicubic, 2 2s are 4, 4 4s are 16. That samples 16 pixels surrounding the site where each new pixel is being made. A little more reconnaissance, a little more detail, and they've added filtration, trying to make them a little more useful, for example, and then variations on the theme. They do a good job for what they are, but they're pretty basic, which is why we might go into PhotoZoom Pro. And here we've got resizing methods in terms of physical scaling. And we have a series of presets and a series of different algorithms, also AI-powered and non-AI-powered, where we have all of these parameters in terms of vividness or successive contrast and artifact reduction and stochastic grain and unsharp masking and so on. Incredible. But it takes a lot longer to process because you're now sampling thousands of pixels for every new pixel that's going to be made up, whether it's textured on a high frequency or a low frequency domain, which is why we tend to use plugins or go out of Photoshop in order to do the scaling to then drop into our RIPs like Mirage. So we've got complete control over it. And just a quick aside from our digital fine art printmaking workshop, how often we still, even with AI-powered decision-making on our behalf, how often we still will resize an image up or down several times with different algorithms for specific areas of the image to keep the clouds that are captured moving across the screen at 60-second exposure, to keep them soft and ethereal, and the AI enhancement of the granite boulders in the foreground or the granularity of the sand. Each version scaled through these different algorithms to exactly the same pixel dimensions so you can Photoshop layer them together. Now, what about industrial RIP production, where you're wanting to throw images into the RIP and let it do all of its scaling and so forth? So I'm starting up the server for Serendipity MegaRip. This server is currently running on this computer. I have the client running on the same workstation, but I could also be printing from another workstation with a client installed. It's the interface configuring and sending images through the server to the printer. All right. Now, we have an enormous number of applications we can work on, and the workbench is where you configure the RIP. We need to define an output, a printer, for example. There's all of our installed printers. We need to define a media that we're printing on, and then we need a set of instructions of how the printer and the media interact. Oh, that's just what Mirage does. Yes, of course it is. It's a RIP. It's a standalone application. And here we've got a range of instructions. And I look at the options. There's color management, process and resampling, fitting, rotating, centering and correcting, cropping and padding, all manner of effects, slug lines, logos, also crop marks and all manner of other things that we can apply, and a separate set of instructions that can then go into a fully automated page setup. Then all 6 employees in the factory or the photo lab can be throwing images at, and then according to all of these instructions will be automatically applied, including processing and resampling. So there's an example of a professional industrial RIP, and they have built into that choice over the algorithms for automated workflows. Whereas in our workflow, we've got access to selection and application of, as I said, multiple scaling algorithms for different areas of the image that we non-destructively layer mask together in dear old Photoshop. And we use MegaRip's filtered rescaling and automatically sizing and cropping and placing and nesting on a roll of paper for high-speed production, doing it automatically, fast and furious for us. But what about the quality? It's pretty simple, isn't it? If it is high volume and you have to therefore automate as much as you can for efficiency, productivity, and return on investment of time, money, and infrastructure and everything else, then it's a no-brainer, isn't it? You run it through the RIP using the best rescaling option and then compare and contrast and see if there is an advantage in terms of quality, not quantity, quality, in another scaling algorithm, and then work out how, if that's superior to your RIP, but you need high-speed production, then you look at scripting, even a Photoshop Action or an Affinity Photo macro, which enables you to go out of the delivery program, Photoshop, for example, and apply third-party scaling to every image that give a higher quality result than the RIP itself will do. And then that goes to the RIP server, which then goes to the printer. So it's still fully automated, but it might take a minute or so longer as part of that file preparation for printing, as opposed to we're doing as little preparation as possible because of time, efficiency, and so forth, trying to get the RIP be a one-stop shop to do it all. But it's a business case in all of those cases, simply because it's a high-volume service. It's not a fine art printing enterprise. Anyway, there's a few hints and clues that might help. And yes, we do indeed know a great deal about this. having set up publication workflows in most of our national institutions, the National Gallery of Victoria, the National Gallery of Australia, the National Library of Australia, and so on. We've looked after our dear friends in those institutions. It'll be an absolute pleasure to look at this notion of preparation for pre-press, whether it's on an indigo or a mechanical press. Indigo is a digital press, and what's involved in such a process, given it is a printing process, but also it's a process you are having to collaborate with others, other equipment, other people, other expertise, designers, pre-press publishers, authors, and so on, in order to achieve the outcome. So let's look at the surrounding caveats, but also some of the parameters that are involved that we need to be mindful of. And I'll use a specific case study to try and illuminate all of this. So here's the image that is being included in the photo book that I'm printing. And I'm working with the designer and with pre-press in terms of delivering the design files with my images embedded. I'm not printing to my local wide gamut Epson or Canon or Hewlett-Packard pigment inkjet printer. Not at all. So first of all, we need to understand the press gamut. And let's use Photoshop because it's so facilitated to do CMYK conversions. Capture One, Lightroom and whatnot. We can proof in CMYK, but we can't edit in CMYK, but we can in Photoshop. So this is very much a Photoshop methodology, not just a process. Here, the designer has asked for CMYK files. Now, do I just do a mode change like that? Hell no, because you've got no control over what version of CMYK you're converted to. So the first question is, as I go down in Photoshop under the Edit menu down to the Convert to Profile, and then noting that the source space is in Adobe RGB 1998, that's the gamut that houses all of the colorimetric data that gives those RGB numbers, correct color meaning, and then what are we converting it to? The designer is asking for CMYK color. So the very first question you have for the pre-press people, the designer, is what offset printing standard you are printing to. Now, if we're in Adobe Photoshop and we haven't set our custom color settings as we were talking about in the last tutorial, then web-coated swap V2 is the default CMYK space the image will be converted to if we simply do image mode change to CMYK. This is a really awful CMYK color space. Think of the gossip magazines in our news agencies, not the glossy covers, but the cheap as chips clay-coated paper inside, where skin tone rarely looks like human skin and what have you. Now, of course, that's fine if that's the standard they're printing to, or if the response you get when you say to the designer, I'm happy to do the conversions for you, but can you tell me what the pre-press industrial standard that you're printing to? If they say on a neutral semi-gloss type 1 paper, there are 5 types of paper that all the papers we print on press fit into, we're still printing to the FOGRA 39 standard. Then you go, thank you very much, and you convert to the FOGRA 39 standard, using relative colorimetric, of course, because you want to take the white point of Adobe RGB and convert it to the paper white, relative to the paper white. Definite black point compensation because colorimetric only converts the white point and scales all the colors sequentially. You definitely want to also scale the black of Adobe RGB to the blackest black that can be printed. And it's all based on the paper stock, what type of paper, which has to do with fluorescence, with white point, warm tone, cold tone, and so forth. But if they say, oh no, just CMYK, just click on the CMYK button in Photoshop, they have no idea what they're doing. So you know that they will be working to the default worst possible case scenario, like swap V2. Now, in the best possible example, we not only have our standard PSO, ISO, industry standard pre-press gamuts, North American grey coal, for example, we also can have custom profiles for a printing press. They have profiled themselves. They're going beyond an ISO standard and turning it into an even more refined rendering that they proof to and that they guarantee they can print to. Now, the problem though, when we go into our proof setup, not the working CMYK, but the custom dialog box, and let's proof to something that's even worse than coated swap V2, web uncoated, remembering a web doesn't mean the internet. It means a continuous web of paper that magazines are printed on. whereas high quality books are sheet fed, swap, standard web offset printing. So here is the uncoated version, and I turn the proofing off and I turn it on. I'm sorry, but yes, this is not an unreasonable outcome because the paper can hold so little ink, and the richness of colors in Adobe RGB, even though these colors would all fit within sRGB. No, in fact, it's a wasteland. So if you're printing in a catalogue on uncoated cheap as chips newsprint like this, then you've got to do all manner of work on your image, which is not just the right number of pixels and the right pixel per inch resolution that your designer and the printing press is expecting, but also to restore and counter what is being destroyed. So the first question is, what space do you want me to convert into? What printing standard? FOGRA 39. The second question is, the paper you're printing on is a certified FOGRA 39 printing stock. Now, what does that mean? It's all about the white point. If we think of our LAB paper white measurements from the Digital Fine Art Printmaking Workshop, for example, the B channel, the yellow to blue channel of LAB nomenclature, LAB color model, minus B numbers are cooler paper whites. Positive B numbers are increasingly warmer paper whites. Platine, for example, rag photographic from Canson, Infinity, have almost neutral A and B channels. They're the most neutral D50 paper. FOGRA 39 has a -2 in the B channel. So it's a slightly cooler paper. You're expecting a paper that looks in daylight, where there's lots of ultraviolet light, exciting any optical brightness in it, that looks quite neutral in those conditions. Now, if you've already got paper samples from our Digital Fine Art Printmaking Workshop, all of those annotated paper samples, we never leave home without that little A5 sheet of Platine fiber rag. And visually, even if you don't have our LED UV lights and other light sources that we take with us to look for pigmentation and fluorescing or otherwise in works of art on site or in papers, in printing presses and what have you, just comparing that FOGRA 39 paper with Platine, you'll see it's a shade more neutral looking. If Platine looks warm, the FOGRA 39 will look a little cleaner. Think roughly a D50, 5,000 degrees Kelvin calibration of the white point of your monitor, and then you flip to 6,500 degrees Kelvin. It's a little cooler, and in a lot of environments will look a little more neutral, which is why in ISO 3664, our viewing working conditions ISO standard, the recommendation is start with a 6,500 degree Kelvin monitor white point, simply because in the largest range of environments, when you're not proofing, you're not exhibiting, you're just working on your screen, you're going to get the most easily adapted state of evaluation of what's on that screen. That is what a FOGRA 39 white point is like. Now, here we go. Here is the caveat. Here is the exception. A lot of printers will still request FOGRA 39 files because they've been printing to FOGRA 39 forever, and they know those separations well, even if they're not printing on FOGRA 39 paper. And these days, more often than not, we're printing on FOGRA 51, FOGRA 52 papers, incredible amounts of fluorescence. But they find that if they try and work with FOGRA 51 files, they just can't get skin tones right. There's no more yellow left to add to try and get rid of the blue in the skin tones. All manner of problems, which you have to be incredibly skilled to overcome. Why are we printing on these fluorescent papers? Because they're cheap as chips. So under UV excitation, they glow and it looks sexy because it's cooler, cleaner, crisper, rather than this dull, awful, you saw what happened when I took the Pilbara trucking landscape and turned that into uncoated web stock. You then try and request a sheet of that paper and compare it if you don't have instrumentation for measuring, and often asking them to give you LAB numbers for the paper is meaningless more often than not. You then visually compare that in UV-rich illumination, such as here in my studio with Southlight in Australia. You compare it with a known white point that is D50 neutral, like Platine or rag photo, and you'll soon see whether that paper is really fluorescent and is looking like commercial typing paper, cheap as chips, or if it's just a little bit cooler than the Platine or the rag photographic white point, neutral white point, then you can proceed with confidence. So let's look at another question that came up during the week, during one of my consultations. about using the frequency domain to create masks. So this is not the colorimetric domain. For example, this is not the tonal composition, not the color composition. This is the frequency domain, the detail in the image. And did you see what happened in Photoshop when I went to that awful web uncoated V2 profile? And suddenly blacks became midtones and midtones became muddy, and we lost all sense of depth and dimensionality in the original file. Let's have a look at this again. No proofing is on, and this is the 5,000 pixel image that's going in the book. Often these images, they're not printed full bleed. I'm not talking about the book design, but just adding another 4 centimeters on all sides with paper white. So now we have paper white that we can proof, and having spoken to our designer and pre-press, the printer stipulated FOGRA 39, which is also called ISO coated V2. It's exactly the same printing press characterization data set compiled by 2 different organizations, FOGRA in Germany or ISO.org. And let's go to relative colorimetric rendering. Remember, colorimetric is the most accurate numerically, not necessarily visually, numerically. In other words, I measure on my screen with my info palette in Lightroom, in Photoshop, in Capture One, the LAB values for this red earth, for example, and I render out my print and I measure with a spectrophotometer and turn that spectral data into LAB values. And within a very small sigma, very low standard deviation, if that colorimetric table is really accurate, it will indeed result in a very close color rendering based on the numbers. But of course, we've got a big question because this is a printer profile. So we also have a perceptual table, a gamut compression algorithm. So one of the first questions is, while we're printing as numerically accurate as we can, and I'm going to OK that. So now in my title bar up here, there's the name of the image and it's scaling. It's an 8-bit image, and because that's what the press is accepting. And there you can see we've got the FOGRA 39 proofing turned on. Though the original image, which is an Adobe RGB, Command Y or Control Y on a PC turns the proofing off and the proofing on. And you can see the FOGRA 39 white point is quite dull. In Photoshop, the lightness remains 100% because it's reading what is in the file, not the simulation where the soft proofing is only changing what we're seeing on screen. So of course it's pure white because I filled the border with pure white. I'm also turning on simulate the paper color. Paper color off, paper color on. Thank you very much, Photoshop. Now, the problem is it's really dulling it down, not just the paper, but the image itself. Of course, I've got my 75% gray surround and livery to try and have this affect what I'm seeing as little as possible. And under the view menu, to turn on gamut warning, seeing if Photoshop reports any colors being out of gamut. In our Photoshop settings, we have our transparency and gamut preferences. Here, the color for those gamut preferences is red. No good if it's a red jacket. I'm looking to see if there's any out of gamut colors, therefore a gray might be more easily identified. But here you can see the areas that are showing up as being out of gamut are just minuscule areas in the clouds. Now, of course, that's inconsequential on a 5,000 pixel wide image, but turning the proofing off and on, we're taking a big hit in the vivaciousness. I'll just reset my workspace. Now, a simple RGB luminosity curve in Photoshop. As we're raising brightness, we're decreasing saturation. Not the way the human visual system works. Proofing off, proofing on. It's not looking good, is it? Unfortunately, that's not going to help. I need to do more than that, which gives me an opportunity to talk about frequency domain masking. I'm going to visit our friends at Retouch for Me, the architects of 3D Look Creator, and these extraordinary mural filter plugins in Photoshop. Let's look at their frequency domain mural filter and initially work our way through this so we feel at home with how it works. But then the ulterior motive is how we're going to use a domain separation to try and breathe more vivaciousness back into my CMYK converted image. First things first, though. I can look at the original, I can invert what I'm doing, I can locally brush it in. I've got strength, amplifying or reducing, presets, 2 bands, 3 bands. The number of frequency domains, low frequency, broad shapes, mid frequency, and fine detail, pores in the skin, texture in the sand, high frequency. 2 bins, all the low, mid-low frequencies separated from the high frequencies. A classic approach in portrait retouching where I'm dialing out the finest details. Let's zoom in before and after. Here's the fine details, pores in the skin, what have you. Noting that control clicking will reset any of these. Let's investigate 3 bands where we're separating the broad details from the mid and the high. Let's remove the high frequencies and let's remove the mid frequencies. So what's left are these broad details, these broad shapes. And I can amplify that. Let's fit that to the screen, or I can reduce that. Let's control click and restore the other domains. Looks like a high pass filter. This is getting interesting. You should know threshold from an unsharp mask or surface blur. How many of something needs to be identified before what I'm doing is applied. There has to be, let's say in an unsharp mask, at least 20 brightness levels difference across a boundary before the sharpening, the width and the amount of sharpening is applied to that boundary. And we have different ways of doing this. I tend to start with the median filter based on luminosity. Down here we have noise and saturation reduction as is required. And at the moment the threshold is 100% applied to everything. But hang on, we've got 2 sets and it goes like this. Can you see? Thresh HLM, low and medium frequency. Threshold HMH, medium and high, where these values start or stop by adjusting those thresholds. Let's reset all of those. But for this exercise, I'm going to leave these at the default settings. And can a frequency domain help me create a simple mask? Leaving the saturation as it is, I could dial out the saturation and turn that into a black and white mask, or I can do that in Photoshop. But let's leave it like this for the moment. You can see it's just the broad frequencies in my image. Let's apply that, and now I have a layer where it's just those low frequencies. If we look at blending on color, hue, saturation. So I could blend on hue, duplicate, blend on saturation, and then with layer opacities, dial in the hue, preservation or color change, saturation, preservation or color change to my heart's content, 50% and so on. I turn everything off and everything on, and I'm starting to see the effects on the colorimetric domain. And it's not like increasing saturation because this is a spatial domain. Mask, how the saturation changes are being applied to the image. So it's starting to reinstate the dimensionality in the picture that was there from the outset. Now, of course, we can go way beyond this. For example, let's make a traditional dodging and burning layer. Let's grab 50% middle gray, keyboard shortcuts to fill with middle gray. Let's blend on one of our contrast blending modes because middle gray crosses between applying the multiply blending mode to all the pixels below middle gray and the screen blending mode to all the pixels above middle gray. But it's not having any effect at the moment because of middle gray. That's the crossover point. What happens if I take a paintbrush with maybe 20% opacity and I start painting with black? You can see how I've darkened that area with the multiply blending mode. Or you do the opposite and paint with white and you're lightening the image. So what am I looking to do? You can see the black outline. Layer 2 is selected, it's active, but it's not doing anything at the moment, no. So why don't I go up to my mighty apply image as we were doing in the last tutorial and go and find layer 1, that low frequency domain mask, and apply that to my image. Now I've got all sorts of blending modes I can evoke, but why don't I just go and do something extreme like a color burn? I reverse that and adding 0, 10, 20, 30% and turn on my hue and my saturation. And now suddenly I've got dodging and burning based on the frequency domain being applied to my image along with colorimetric data based on the frequency domain. And I can build into my image all manner of mischief and solutions according to my heart's content. So that's an example of taking elements from one domain to mask, attenuate, enhance, verify another domain. In my case, both tonal and colorimetric domains, which of course then goes back into the spatial domain, which restores in my image depth and dimensionality that simple saturation and curves just cannot do as easily. And it's all based on elements within the image itself. So I'm not having to make anything up. I'm just using, as Andre likes to say, stuff that the image has already given me as drawn by my beautiful lenses. Thank you, Hasselblad, in that case, is then giving me the stuff that I need to do what else I want to do with it. And in this sense, this also continues that discussion we were having in the last tutorial. Another great question. We're in Capture One. I'm exporting a single file intended to go to Mirage for printing. I know the size of the sheet I'm printing on, therefore I can scale in my export dialog in Capture One with real precision. But is that where I do the sizing? My question back is, what does Capture One allow you to choose in terms of the algorithm to be used to do that resizing? Exactly. Silence, because it gives you no choice. Even Photoshop gives us a choice between variations of bilinear, bicubic, nearest neighbor. So then the question becomes, and because it is a fine art printing workflow, a single export out of Capture One to make my absolutely beautiful fine art print, then why don't we export at full size out of Capture One and then scale it in a couple of tests? Let's look at what S-Spline Max does. Let's have a look at what Photoshop does with bicubic sharper. Let's have a look at a couple of options and make some test prints. Or what we love to do, take sections out of each of those images, exactly the same selection, layer them side by side and print out a single sheet, as long as you've typed underneath each one that this is S-Spline Max with those settings, this is bicubic sharper, this is whatever the algorithm is you're using, and then compare that with the strip of the downsized file that Capture One has provided you with and see if there's any difference. Now, remember the caveat is, seeing any difference completely depends on whether the file you're printing has the qualities that will actually show a difference between those different scaling algorithms. If it's handheld 60 seconds of moving clouds, you will see no difference more or less between any of those scaling algorithms. But if it's an IQ4 100 or Hasselblad multi-shot capture of a scene, incredible high-resolution Schneider lenses on a really stable tripod with no subject movement at all, boy, will you ever see a difference in that landscape. Or a Hasselblad portrait of a face in close-up, eyelashes and pores in the skin, boy, will you ever see a difference. The question then becomes more methodological than process. It then becomes, is that a difference that matters or that I care about? So you then put those differences on the drawing board as yet another criteria, another possibility to consider. For example, going all the way back to our automated RIP, rescaling, resizing, from doing hundreds of images a day, then really it's the fastest method of getting a somewhat acceptable result across all sorts of different images. That's what I'll resize with. No, in this case, Capture One, single export to print on a standardized size through Mirage Print. That's when I would do those tests, and that's when I would make a decision whether or not for that image or images shot with the same equipment under the same conditions, with the same resolution and care and concerns, whether or not that then enables me to export and let Capture One do the scaling for me and end up with a more than acceptable result. Or, no, thanks Capture One, I'm just going to export full size, there's my preservation asset, there's my master file, then I'm going to, with more sophisticated ways and means that I have control over, there I'm going to downscale it. Now, here's a couple of questions that came in earlier in the week that I want to quickly address because they're not insignificant. This is an addendum to past tutorials about matching colors via numerical identification and evaluation. Here in Photoshop, look at these colors. They're not the same color, are they? I drag my info palette across, noting I've already added sample points reporting in the RGB color space. This is an untagged but nevertheless RGB file. Look at the numbers. They're identical. No way my brain is saying they're the same color because of simultaneous contrast. Let's go into channels where I've already made and saved an isolation mask. Let's load that as a selection, invert that mask, add a new layer up and fill with black. And you can see the numbers are right, Photoshop is right, they are the same color. They're not the same color. And this is the dilemma we face if we're trying to numerically get equivalency within each of the stages of our workflow, from capture to screen to print to press and web distribution. And of course, the colors have to be within gamut colors in order to have any hope of equivalency. But as you can see, it's all about context. Why are we running a 75% light gray livery? Why can't I do this in Capture One? Why can't I do this in Lightroom? So this is important on all levels. So there is numerical equivalency, but there is also visual equivalency where I might need to change this color, obviously darken it down with this surround in order to make it look similar to that color. Scanning workflows. And this was a very thoughtful question from one of our workshop attendees during the workshop through consultation. So here's an enlarged section from the document that was sent asking about understanding their scanning workflow. Now, in our magnificent Hasselblad Flextight scanners using the Flex Color software, there is the 3F raw file format, flexible file format that we can scan into, producing a raw file rather than a processed TIFF file. Noticing that no matter what the PPI is, the file size doesn't change. And here, you see, file size is not changing, even though the output resolution is changing. So let's break this down. First of all, why scan the raw file? There's an old saying, scan once, output many. 3F scanning in Flex Color from Hasselblad driving their magnificent Flextight scanners, that's capturing the raw data, which means depending on the format you're scanning, 5.4, 35mm, here 617 panos, the highest resolution the scanner is capable of achieving over that distance, that is what your 3F file is. In other words, it's capturing all of the raw data, whereas a TIFF is processed data. So it doesn't matter how that raw data is assembled, right? 100%, absolutely. But at a high pixel per inch resolution, the physical size is only 6.3 by 17.7 centimeters. At 300 pixels per inch needed for the large format Canon printer, it's now 67.67 by 188.79 centimeters. Of course, it's the same total number of pixels, just now the pixels are 300 per inch, and therefore they extend over a much greater distance, whereas here they're tiny little pixels. There's 3,200 of them per inch per 24.5 millimeters. So they're compacted over a much, much smaller distance, which is close to the actual size that's being scanned, which means this is the maximum resolution the scanner is capable of exhibiting without interpolation over that distance. So I thought that's a really important distinction to make between raw versus processed. And if we think of the 3F file as our preservation master, as in our fine art reproduction workshops, workflows from which we make all of these derivatives, such as a TIFF file that is scaled to print at a certain resolution over a certain distance in order to fulfill the derivatives criteria. In that case, a magnificent exhibition print. And Canon printer drivers for their Pro 2000, 4000, and 6000 printers are no longer compatible with OS 15. And this is the dialog box one gets when trying to install the Canon printer driver that worked perfectly before I upgraded to the latest Mac OS. Now, we've seen this repeat itself over many years when our A2 desktop printers from Epson suddenly were no longer supported. And my friend had this printer in perfect condition and a spare brand new in the cupboard, ready to go, and suddenly she couldn't print. Through Photoshop, as she'd printed all of her wedding and portrait work for years and years. Now, of course, the solution was simple. It wasn't free, but it was simple. You then install professional printing software like Mirage, which she did, The halftone screening module is built into Mirage. You're going to get the same quality as printing through the Canon printer driver, except we don't need it because we're printing through an application rather than the operating system's print path, which is no longer compatible. Now, to Canon's credit in this case, their professional print and layout application is up to date. That does work in OS 15. So then what's the problem with my friend now suddenly going, I can't print through the printer driver? Fine, just print through the professional print and layout application. You've got all the same settings, all the same controls, and some people would say it is a RIP-like interface, similar to Mirage perhaps. Not quite, but similar to Mirage perhaps. What's the problem, Les? Of course, the problem is my friend on the Mac has been printing through Print Tool, Roy Harrington's magnificent print tool, to put back the no color management facilitation that Mac has removed episodically over all these years from their print path in order to be able to print with a fully color managed black and white print workflow, i.e. working with custom black and white profiles, not just custom RGB profiles. And this was the dilemma they were facing, because printing through Print Tool with custom black and white profiles, custom black and white profiles, but I don't have a driver anymore. I can't do that anymore. Oh, no driver, but you've got the professional print and layout application. Yes, but that does not support black and white custom profiles. When you select the Canon black and white photo mode, color management's all grayed out. It's a non-color managed print path. So there's the brick wall. Now, Mirage in this case is not a solution, because Mirage also does not support a fully color managed black and white print path. When you select gray printing in Mirage, you've got no tinting or toning. You've only got the gamma adjustments, normal, darker, lighter, and so forth. I can't use my custom black and white profiles in Mirage either. Now, we've addressed this in various tutorials in recent weeks, so I'm not going to reiterate any of those discussion points. I just note that this is the dilemma that many of us are facing. Software abandonment, software isolation, let's call it. Now, the way we've tackled this over a long period of time, decades in fact, is to source an old Mac that runs the right OS that printer driver works with, and we print through that. It's not that different from an industrial fine art printing RIP like Serendipity Mega RIP, where we have a server and then the client talking to the server. The server just happens to be the iMac over in the corner. Oh, but hang on. The Windows 11 driver, last updated 23rd of November last year, still works on Windows 11. Why don't I just print through that driver? So there's lots of solutions, but they tend now to be hardware solutions as the shrinking software adaptability, flexibility, support, and otherwise begins to leave us high and dry. As always, wish you all the best with your adventures in this magnificent world of art and photography that we adore, share, and love together. Take care. All the best. See you soon. Cheers.